So our topic for today, there's really nothing new today. We've gone through 4 methods for solving quadratics, but each time whenever you've been in a lesson, it's been, oh, solve this by factoring, solve this by completing the square, solve this by quadratic formula, and solve this by completing the square. Now what we're going to see is, and like you'll see on the test, there'll be quadratics, and you get to solve by any method, okay? So let's talk about it. Solving by square roots. When do we solve something by square roots? Yeah, you see something that's a perfect square. So in this case, I could multiply all of that out, I could distribute, I could add the 5, and then I could factor it back together. When I see something squared, solving by square roots is your best method. So this is going to be 2x plus 3 squared equal negative 5, which means x plus 3 squared equal negative 5 over 2. Take the square root of both sides. X plus 3 equal plus or minus the square root of, what, negative 5 halves? What kind of number is that going to be? Complex. Your final solution is going to be x equal negative 3 plus or minus I times the square root of 5 halves. Okay. Now your instructions might say to rationalize, if you were asked to rationalize the denominator, that square root of 5 over the square root of 2, you can multiply by the square root of 2 over the square root of 2, and that gives you what? The square root of 10 over 2. Okay. So another way of writing this would be negative 3 plus or minus I square root of 10 over 2. I don't think I'm going to get too hung on. I think I would take either of those as the answer. But there might be a problem on the test that says rationalize this expression. Okay, so just be familiar with that. Solve by factoring. When can we use solve by factoring? It's one of those duh moments. You can solve by factoring when it factors. Not every one of these will factor. The one that we just did up here, do you think, looking at that answer, would that have come from factoring? No, when you have rational numbers and complex numbers, we're only factoring over rational numbers. So the only way this factors is if b squared minus 4ac is a perfect square. So you got two things you can do here. You can say, so b squared minus 4ac is going to be what? Negative 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 10. That's going to be 9 plus 40, which is 49. That's a perfect square. So that tells me that that radical is going to go away because of a perfect square. This is factorable. That's the way to tell that it's factorable. The other way is, can you find two numbers that do what? Multiply to negative 10 and add to negative 3. What is that, a negative 5 and a positive 2? If you can find numbers that make this happen, then regardless of the discriminant here, this factors. So this is simply what? X minus 5, x plus 2 equals 0. Therefore, x is equal to what? 5 or negative 2. Okay? Everyone see what we did there? So taking square roots of both sides, factoring. The other one is the quadratic formula. How do you feel about the quadratic formula? Is it okay? Is it okay? Amazing is what I'm hearing. This one always works. Okay, doesn't matter what condition you're in. This will always work. But you can tell it's probably, if this is more work than this. If you can see the factoring, that's a quicker route to a solution. But if I say solve any method, you are always fine to use a quadratic formula on each one of these. The challenge with the complex formula, you got to be really good with your arithmetic and simplifying and not making mistakes. Okay. The other method was solve by completing the square. I'm guessing that maybe is your least likely method, least favorite. It works for any quadratic equation, but sometimes it can be overkill for something that factors. The arithmetic can get a little bit involved. And remember the way we did that was, if you were factoring something like, x squared plus 16x minus 1 equals 0. Then to complete the square, you would write this as x squared plus 16x equal 1. And then you would figure out, what is half of 16? 8. So I would add 8 squared. If I add 8 squared over there, I have to add 8 squared over here. Okay. So what is the left side? This is what? That's x plus 8 squared. Okay. Because I've got two numbers that multiply to give me 64 and add to give me 16. That's 8 and 8. So this is equal to what? 65. All right. So x plus 8 equal plus or minus the square root of 65. X equal negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 65. Could I have solved this by factoring? Yes or no? Two numbers that multiply to negative 1 and add to 16. Not going to happen. Anytime you see that square roots, this was not going to factor. You were going to have to use quadratic formula or completing the square in this one. But you notice completing the square, when we get completing the square, at this point it turns into what kind of method? Once I get to here. Taking square roots, okay? So completing the square is turning it into a complete, solve by square roots, okay? So let's talk about these before we dig in. Solving by square roots. What is the pros or cons? What are pros of solving by square roots? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty easy, okay? What are the cons? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean there could be some arithmetic you don't like. But if it's going to present that, it's probably going to present in the quadratic formula. And the other thing, not everything is in this form. So things are not always. So if you've got an equation that's not in a perfect square form, you've either got to get it that way or move on to a different method. What about solving by factoring? What's good about that one? Doesn't always work. Yeah, so it's easy or straightforward, a big if it's factorable, okay? And it's pretty quick to get to, yeah, there's not a lot of heavy arithmetic. If it's factorable, it's pretty straightforward. One of the cons is not everything is factorable, so these first two are easy if you're given the right circumstances, okay? But you're not always given things that fit these first two categories. What about the quadratic formula?
Always works.
Yeah, always works. What do people not like about it? Yeah, so lots of arithmetic. Pardon me?
I said you have to remember a song.
The song, okay? It always works. And keep in mind, I don't know if some people, when you look at the quadratic formula,
Wait, what song was that too?
Pop Goes the Weasel. What was x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a.
I like the one with the French
Okay. You can do that one then. Now, with the quadratic formula, guys, you can just plug in all of these values straight into the formula. Or what's the other way you can do it? You can break it into two pieces and do what? No? You can just plug in all these numbers and start simplifying, but there was another way that I did it. What did I do first? Find b squared minus 4ac first. That breaks off that part of the arithmetic. And now you know what was I actually doing when I was doing that? The discriminant. So that can tell me if b squared minus 4ac is 49, I know that I'm going to get two real rational roots, okay, for that. So you now know a little bit more. So you could just find b squared minus 4ac first and then plug that in. Makes it a little bit easier on the arithmetic. And then completing the square, pluses or minuses here. Yeah, it always works, okay. Sometimes it can get complicated, okay? So it can get complicated with fractions. It works better on the ones that are x squared as opposed to the ax squared, okay? So it works better. when you've got x squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And it's harder when you have ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay? So you need to have all of these methods down and be able to pick and choose which is the easiest thing to do in which scenario. So if I'm looking at this, what's the first, how am I going to solve this guy? Yeah, I'm going to solve this by taking square roots, okay, because I see a perfect square. So I'm going to get x plus 5 equal what? Plus or minus the square root of 25? So
It could be plus or minus if you know the square root, which is 5.
it's still going to have a plus or minus. Okay, you're going to have two real rational solutions. X equal negative 5 plus or minus 5. So that gives me x equal 0 or negative 10. Okay, that's the easiest way to solve this. Now, I mean, because I could do this. I could do x squared plus 10x plus 25 equal 25. I could expand that out. I could subtract 25 from both sides. So I get x squared plus 10x equals 0. I could factor this using the greatest common factor. What's the greatest common factor? No. X plus 10 equals 0. X is equal to what? 0 or negative 10. Okay. That's another way to do it. Okay. The other thing I could do is, once I got to here, A is equal to 1, B is equal to 10, C is equal to 0. I could use quadratic formula. That just feels like more work. So when you've got something squared, it's probably leading you toward solving by square roots. Okay, what about the next one? So my choices are quadratic formula, completing the square, factoring. Okay, so to factor, I got to find two numbers that do what? No. Multiply to 7, add the negative 6. Okay. What are the only factors of 7? So these are my only choices. Is there any way those numbers add to give me 6? No. This will not factor. Okay. Now, the other thing I do, let's just figure out what's b squared minus 4ac. That's going to be negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 7, right? So that's 36 minus 28, which is what? 8? So this tells me what kind of solutions do I expect? Two real irrational. So I'm going to go ahead and use the quadratic formula. Okay? So x is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Okay? So this is x equals 6 plus or minus the square root of 2 times 4 over 2. So x is 6 plus or minus 2 root 2 over 2. This can be simplified. This is, and you were expected to do this, 6 over 2 plus or minus 2 over 2 times the square root of 2. So what does this simplify to? What's 6 over 2? 3. Yeah, plus or minus square root of 2. Those are my two solutions, okay? So you don't want to spend a lot of time kicking around like, oh, I'm just trying to factor and I've spent about 20 minutes and I just can't figure it out. You got to punt. If you try to factor, this one does not factor. If it factors and you're not able to find it, you can punt and go to the quadratic formula. Yes, sir.
On the x, do we need to put
3 plus or minus the square root of 2, or do you want to put 3 plus square root of 2?
Either way, I'll take that as an answer. I'll take, these are equivalent form. I would take either of those as an answer. Okay. Okay. Solve by any method. So what do we see here? First of all, if I'm going to factor it, I need two numbers that multiply to give me 5 times 24, which is what? That's 120. No. And add to negative 10. Okay. Numbers that multiply to positive 120 and add to negative 10. Pardon me? I'm not hearing. So. Yeah, so I'm thinking, okay, I'm having a hard time. Maybe there are numbers that do that, but that's not jumping out at me. Okay, what else could I do? I could use a quadratic formula or completing the square. Let's try a quadratic formula. A, B, C. A is 5. B is negative 10. C is 24. Okay, so B squared minus 4AC is going to be negative 10 squared minus 4 times 5 times 24. So that's going to be, what is 16 squared is 256, all right? So this is 256 minus, where? Oh, yeah, thanks. I wrote it down. Couldn't read my own writing, so let's just make that a little bit better. So this is 100 minus, I think 480, 4 times 5. So 100 minus 480 is going to be what? Negative 380. So what kind of solutions am I going to get? Complex, okay? So x equal negative of negative 10 plus or minus the square root of negative 380. All of that over 2 times 5, okay? Do I leave it like that? Now I got to work on this 380 over here, okay? So 380, I know it's divisible by 2. If I divide it by 2, I get what? 190. Divide that by 2, and I get 95. That's divisible by what? 5. 5 will go into there. 1, 9. Okay. So let's just check and see. What is 380? Is it 2 times 2 times 5 times 19? Yeah, that's 380. So if I'm taking the square, what number is 2 times 2? 4. This is 4 times 5 times 19. Okay. Right? So how do I take the square root? So this is going to be x equal negative of negative 10. So it's going to be positive 10. 10 plus or minus 2. And then 5 times 19 is what? 95. All of that over 10. So this is 1 plus or minus square root of 95. Oh, it's an I, sorry. So there's an I, and back up. So you got 10, so x is equal to 10 over 10 plus or minus 2i over 10 times the square root of 95. So this is 1 plus or minus the square root of 95 times I over 2 over 10 is 1 over 5. Is there a question? 2 over 10 is the same as 1 over 5. So 2/10 is 1/5. Yeah. Okay. So this one, the only way to solve this would have been quadratic formula or completing the square. Quadratic formula is easier than completing the square on this guy. Solve by any method. What about this guy? Now what you can do, you can just, one strategy is, let's figure out b squared minus 4ac, and that will tell us if it factors or not, okay? So b squared minus 4ac, that's negative 11 squared minus 4 times 6 times 4. That's what, 121 minus, what is 6 times 16? That's 96. All right. 16 times 6. So 121 minus 96 is 21 plus 4. This is 25. So what does it tell me if b squared minus 4ac is 25? What kind of number is that? Perfect square. So I can, at this point, I've already found b squared minus 4ac. I could just go ahead and use a quadratic formula. Or I could factor it. What would you rather do? So let's try both ways. Let's just go ahead with a quadratic formula. So it's going to be negative of negative b plus or minus the square root of 25 over 2a. So that's going to be 11 plus or minus 5 over 12. So 11 plus 5 is what, 16? So it's going to be 16 over 12. 11 minus 5 is going to be 6 over 12. So this is going to be 4/3 or 1/2. Okay. Now, if I were to factor it, I would need two numbers that multiply to give you what? This is where you said 24, okay? And they add to give you negative 11. So what numbers can multiply to give you 24 and add to give you negative 11? Come on, guys. The factors of 24, yeah, it's going to be 1 or 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8. That's going to be the ones right there. So it's going to be negative 3 and negative 8. So I rewrite this equation as what? 6x squared minus 3x minus 8x plus 4 equals 0. What can I factor out of the first two terms? 3x. X minus 3x times 2x minus 1 minus, you copy down that sign, and this is a 4, and that's 2x minus 1 equals 0. This tells me 3x minus 4, 2x minus 1 equals 0. X is going to be equal to 4/3 or 1/2. Which of these felt easier? Yeah, I think in this case maybe the quadratic formula was easier, okay? The point is, don't get stuck on trying to force. If you're trying to factor and it doesn't work and the problem says use any method, know that you can go to quadratic formula. If the problem said to solve by factoring, then I'm indicating that I want you to solve by factoring, okay? But there'll be some that say solve by any method. What about the next one? First of all, does it factor? I would need numbers that multiply to negative 7 and add to 3. What are the factors of negative 7? 1 and 7. There's no way this is going to work, okay, to factor. If it can't factor, then my choice is going to be quadratic formula, completing the square. If I complete the square, I've got to take half of 3 and square. What's half of 3? It's 3 halves and square it. Do you like squaring 3 halves and working with that? So what do you want to do here? Yep. A, B, C. A is equal to 1. B is equal to 3. C is negative 7. Okay. So here I'll just substitute it all in at one time. So negative 3 plus or minus 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 7. All of that over 2 times 1. What I try to do is try to just substitute in. Try not to do too much mental math. Like try not to do 4 times 1 times 7 and then write down that number. Write everything in it just like it is, then start simplifying. So x is negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 9, what is this, plus 28. All of that over 2. So x is negative 3 plus or minus, that's going to be what, 37. All of that over 2. And that's as far as that one can go. Okay. Negative 3 plus or minus square root of 37 over 2. There's no further simplification here. You know, you could write it. It's not going to change anything. Negative 3 halves plus or minus 37 over 2. Either of these would be good answers. Okay. If this had been the square root of 20, though, I want you to simplify that. Yeah, but square root of 37, there's nothing I can do for that. Solve by any method. What do we think here? Are there numbers that multiply to negative 50 and add to 5? Yeah, so negative 10, positive 5, that adds to negative 50, and it multiplies to negative 50 and adds to negative 5. So what can I do with these numbers? Oh, it'd be the other way around. It'd be this. Those two numbers multiply to negative 50 and they add to 5. So this is just going to be x plus 10, x minus 5 equals 0. What is x equal to? Yeah, 5 or negative 10. Okay. So for the ones that start out with x squared in terms of bx instead of 2 or 3x squared, if this factors, that's the easiest way. Okay. If you did not see that, you could always do the quadratic formula. So b squared minus 4ac is going to be 5 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 50. So that's 25 plus 200, which is 225. That's a perfect square. That's 15 squared. So x is equal to negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 225 over 2a. So this is x equal negative 5 plus or minus 15 over 2. So this gives me what? If I take the positive sign, so 15 minus 5 is going to be 10. 10 over 2 is 5. And if I take the negative sign, that's negative 20 over 2, negative 10. So here, quadratic formula is a little bit more work, but you can always get there, okay? So you just need to be real confident, guys, when you see one of these that, okay, do I see a method that works and have a fallback? If I can't figure out, if you did not figure out this was factorable, not too much work to do quadratic formula. Work for this section that do that, and then also in the review. Okay, this one is easy, but don't make it harder than it is. So how would I solve this next one? Completing the square, I could do that. There's one. The easiest method is factoring. What do these two things have in common? X. So I could write this as x times x plus 7 equals 0. Now you set each factor equal to 0. What is x? Yeah, x equals 0 or what? Negative 7. That is the easiest way to solve that guy, okay? Now, you could solve it with quadratic formula. A is 1, B is 7, C is 0, okay? So x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So this is negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 49 over 2. So this is negative 7 plus or minus 7 over 2. So if you take the plus, that's going to give you a 0 and a negative 0 and negative 7 are your two answers there. Okay? So you can still get there any method. What about this one? If it factors, what do I need? Multiply to? No. Multiply to 1 and add to negative 1. My only choices are this. These two numbers add to 2. These two numbers add to negative 2. This will not factor, okay? It will not factor, so I can do either completing the square or quadratic formula. What do you want to do? Quadratic formula. So a is equal to 1, b is negative 1, c is 1. So b squared minus 4ac is going to be negative 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times 1. So this is 1 minus 4, which is negative 3. The bells in your head tell you these answers are going to be what kind of numbers? Complex. So x equal negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all of that over 2a. So this is going to be 1 plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2. Okay. You could leave your answer like that, or you can write it as x equal 1/2 plus or minus I square root of 3 over 2. Either way. Okay. How does this feel? Like I said, we're throwing a lot of stuff together, all these methods. What about this one? What's the easiest way to solve this one? Square root. You've got something squared all by itself. Take the square root of both sides. X plus 7 equal plus or minus the square root of negative 16. What's the square root of negative 16? 4i. So this is x plus 7 equal 4i. What does x equal? Wait, plus or minus. X is equal to negative 7 plus or minus 4i. This one would be much harder to use quadratic formula because you would have to expand this to x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals negative 16. Set it equal to 0. A lot more involved. Anytime you see something squared all by itself, it's been set up for you to use the square roots, okay?